Okay, good afternoon. I see participants are slowly entering our room. Welcome, good afternoon from Brussels. My name is Jörg Mühlenhoff. I'm the head of the European Energy Transition Program at the Heinrich-Böll Foundation here in our Brussels office. This afternoon, you're right here in the webinar on climate ambition under the Clean Industrial Deal. The question for the next 60 minutes is, do we have the right tools for reaching the targets in the EU? You're very much welcome. We will discuss this with authors of our updated Green Deal Risk Radar. And we also have policymakers and practitioners from agriculture, for industry, to discuss what that means in the real life, in every day. This webinar will be registered, and you can, of course, download the slides afterwards. Again, you can use the Q&A box if you have any questions. We, of course, want to interact with you. Please feel free to use the Q&A box to post your questions that we will then try to pick up, answer, and discuss with the participants. For those who don't know us, the Heinrich-Böll Foundation is a German political foundation that is financed through the German federal government and affiliated with the German Green Party. We work as a kind of watchdog. We monitor and try to explain EU policies here in Brussels and in many other countries. So you might have followed our first EU Green Deal Risk Radar published in September in last autumn, just before the European Commission entered into office. We thought this is the right moment now, more or less half a year later, to look back, to do a kind of stock-taking exercise with our authors, with experts again, to see how this has evolved. Ursula von der Leyen, of course, she committed to continue towards net zero emissions, climate neutrality 2050. However, the name has changed, the focus has changed. There are many EU laws that have already been changed or that will be revised during the next few months according to the Commission's plans. So do we still have the right tools on board to reach our targets towards 2050? Is the Clean Industrial Deal really fit for purpose? Just for those who are not into the details of this risk radar that we published and that we have updated now, it is basically a collection of 22 EU laws. I will quickly show you here how to read these 22 scorecards, each of them presenting one EU law that we think is relevant under the European Green Deal. We analyzed them together with our authors and peer reviewers, and we first checked what's really in it, what's in this specific EU law in terms of climate ambition. Is it really heading towards 1.5 degree? Is it helping to respect this threshold? Is it bringing us towards really a renewable energy system? Does it help to bring citizens into this energy transition industry process to benefit from it? Does it really help to protect biodiversity? And what does this EU law in the end mean for zero pollution? And you then have a very simple color coding, a kind of traffic light system. Although the German traffic light coalition just ended, we kept at least this color coding just to give you an orientation. Is it good, mixed, or poor prospects? And then you see on the next slide, we looked into the risks. We have several risk categories to check whether there is a low green, a middle, or a high risk for the specific EU law. So is there a risk that this EU law might be slowed down by in the policy process in terms of speed? Is there a conflict on distributional effects, meaning is there somebody struggling for money? Does it not work? Is there a risk that the polluter pays principle will be undermined? Are there practices that might deepen global inequality? Because many of these EU laws also, of course, have an impact beyond the EU on the global scale. And we also were wondering, is there maybe an open door for fossil fuels or for the nuclear industry through this specific EU law? And you see, for instance, here we picked the deforestation regulation as an example. We think this is really very positive in terms of the prospects, but there are, of course, huge risks. We see that it has already somehow been slowed down and delayed. There is a struggle around the money. There is maybe not a big risk on the license for polluters that might be emitted, but still we see certain risks for inequalities. You can find these scorecards, 22 scorecards for each of these EU laws and a summary on our website, eu.böll.org, to go into the details. But before discussing the findings of this risk radar update with our co-authors, we thought that, first of all, it would be good to have your view, your opinion. What do you think about what the European Commission should do? What do we need for reaching our targets? You see here in the pop-up box question for potential answers. Please just choose, tick your answer. What do we really need for reaching the targets? The Clean Industrial Deal wants to achieve, of course, both climate ambition and competitiveness, merging them, marrying them. Do we first need to remove the red tape and reduce administrative hurdles? Tick there. Second option, ensure investment security with reliable legislation or targets. Or third option, do you think, first of all, the EU should provide a targeted financial support for those who are the biggest polluters so that they can cut their emissions? Or do you think the most important thing is that we promote market-based instruments, that we keep everything technology neutral? We wait a bit for your opinion, for ticking the boxes. And I would like to ask then our colleagues now, after a few seconds, maybe for the first results, just to see and understand what your priorities are for today, so that also our panelists can maybe refer to that. I'm curious. Can we then see the results? Okay, that looks like a very clear result, a very clear opinion. You think that, first of all, the EU should ensure investment security with reliable legislation and targets. Okay, let's stick to clear legislation and targets. Great to know. Thanks a lot for participating. And now, after this poll, we would now hand over to our two co-authors, Wendel Trio, climate energy policy expert, Nora Hiller, senior policy expert from the Institute for European Environmental Policy. You contributed, you worked on this update of the risk radar. Over to you to explain a bit what is really in it, what are your key findings, what should we watch out for?
Thank you, Jörg. Thank you for the introduction and the very interesting poll. I will first speak, and then Nora will take over, and we will switch across slides. So next slide, please. So I think it's clear for everybody that we are facing a number of crises in this world. Daily news portraits quite worrying projections with regard to climate change, with regard to biodiversity, with regards to equality and human rights, peace, democracy, and so on. So it's very clear that we're facing a number of challenges, in particular also on climate and biodiversity, which the European Green Deal wanted to address. And it's very clear that while the European Green Deal is a very good first step, it doesn't align with the level of the crisis. And that means that we actually need overachievement of the different proposals that are on the table or that have been adopted. And we, at this moment, see the opposite. We see that instead of overachieving, the EU and EU member states are not performing well. We see three major challenges. One is that some of the legislation is being questioned and that we're not going forward, but rather backwards. Secondly, that a number of the files that are on the table for negotiations are not moving forward or not moving forward rapidly enough. And thirdly, there's clearly a problem with implementation of the files that have been approved. And as a clear example, I think we can refer to the national energy and climate plans that member states had agreed to introduce by middle of last year. There are still a number of member states that haven't introduced these plans, and the Commission has not been able to make a final assessment, thereby also not being able to really assess the level of implementation of things that need to happen in the next 5 years. So that's definitely an indication of the problems we have. Last year, well, half a year ago, we identified two clear files at risk. One was the cars and CO2 standards, and the other one was the EU deforestation regulation. We've seen in the last 6 months an impact on both, and I will say a bit more in the next slide. But before that, we've seen a continued lobbying of specific industry sectors, the fossil fuel industry, energy intensive industry, parts of the farming sector, parts of the SME sector, all kind of lobbying against the European Green Deal, against specific components of the European Green Deal, and calling for more flexible measures for specific sectors to move forward in their endeavors. That has remained. We were hoping 6 months ago that the international dynamics and the international pressure coming from, for instance, COP16 in Colombia, on biodiversity, or COP29 in Azerbaijan focusing on climate, to bring a bit more of a positive dynamic around these issues. But that hasn't really happened, and we're noticing that the EU is less and less vulnerable to that international pressure. As an example, the European Union is at the moment the only member state of the G7 that has not submitted a 2035 climate target to the UN. Of course, with the caveat that the US target comes from the previous administration and is not that valid anymore, but still it is a message that the EU is running behind. Next slide. So 6 months ago, we said that the car CO2 standards and the EU deforestation regulation were under threat. And in both cases, we've actually seen an impact of that threat in the sense of a delay of the implementation of the EU deforestation regulation, and a change, not completely set yet, but a change in the penalty system for the car CO2 standards. It's not final yet, but as both the Parliament and the Council has adopted the same amendments, the trilogues is not necessary, and the finalization will come very soon. So we've seen already the impact of the actions, while on the other hand, 6 months ago, the emissions trading system, the original emissions trading system, was not under threat, and that is still not the case. And there's actually more and more rumors around a post-2030 expansion of the ETS to cover not only the ETS2 sectors, but potentially also agriculture, forestry, and land use. We now see also more files at risk. The CAP strategic plans have been impacted by the simplification package, the so-called omnibus legislation, and similarly, the Critical Raw Materials Act is being pushed and under threat. There are many more files that are facing implementation problems. You see the list here. To note that all of these files relate to EU member states having binding targets or having to introduce national plans. All of those seem to be extremely difficult, and it's hard for member states to implement what they agreed. And then there's a number of files that we clearly have identified. That was less the case in the first assessment, but now that they impact international dynamics, that they are potentially having a negative impact either on specific countries, but also on vulnerable communities, and that needs to be addressed. And I will now give the floor to Nora.
Thank you, Wendell. So to continue with the key findings, as you already mentioned, there are several files on the simplification measures, and some of the ones that we've analyzed in the risk radar are the CSRD under the omnibus package. We've seen some significant reduction of the scope and also removal of possible sector-specific standards. Practitioners have both welcomed the reduced regulatory burden, but some of them, and also specifically civil society, are warning against reducing information flow. Oh yeah, the next slide. Reducing information flow on sustainability risks and introducing also an uncertainty over previously agreed rules. Then also, as mentioned by Wendell before, the CAP with the simplification package of May last year, which brought forward some exemptions from rules and lower standards, which again is also set to slow down the progress in meeting climate and biodiversity targets. Then also similar to the 2024 risk radar, we flagged the files at risk from being influenced for lower environmental standards by the fossil fuel industry. There we can see the Renewable Energy Directive, for instance, with watering down the target for transport, but also, as previously mentioned, the car's CO2 standard. And then lastly, some of the files explored are delayed or even withdrawn entirely. And they're all listed here. For instance, the Energy Taxation Directive, there we're waiting for proposal and agreements by the co-legislators. And the soil monitoring law, their trilogues closed in April, but agreements still have to be endorsed. And the pesticides regulation, for instance, was withdrawn altogether. Next slide, please. Now, going on from that, I certainly remember 2025 always being teased as a considerable milestone for change, and especially in the run-up to the global 2030 climate and environmental goals. Now, from what we've seen, it is obvious that progress is more at risk this year, and environmental legislation faces increasing pressure from competing political and economic priorities. And of course, geopolitical tensions are on the rise. We see that everywhere, but the climate crisis is not on pause, and we cannot simply focus on short-term goals. The risk radar shows how urgently we need to find that balance between acting on the triple planetary crisis, which means climate change, global pollution and biodiversity loss, global competitiveness, and simplification and efficiency. And good policymaking will support all three goals, and also underlines that environmental legislation supports the other goals in the long run. So for the first key message is that simplification must not lead to deregulation. We cannot lower our ambitions and delay critical climate action. Especially now, science and evidence-based policymaking is more important than ever, and policymakers and civil society need to ensure that this remains the core of EU policy files. I'm going to give over to Wendell for some more key messages.
Thank you. Next slide, please. An important test for the coming months for the Green Deal in general and for the level of ambition of the EU will be the adoption of the 2035/2040 climate target. As you may know, the European climate law foresees that the European Commission will amend the climate law or propose an amendment to the climate law with a target for 2040 for emission reductions. And within the context of the Paris Agreement, the EU has a commitment to submit a 2035 climate pledge to the United Nations. The climate law amendment should have been made already middle of last year. The UN pledge should have been made early this year. In both cases, the EU is running a bit behind. The Commission has made a first proposal, though not in the form of an amendment, but in the form of a communication. and is now waiting for member states to show positive response, I think, before they will make it into an amendment. This is critically important, what comes out of this debate, in the sense that it might impact many or almost all of the policy files that we're debating, because it will define the level of ambition post 2030. But the outcome of this debate will also give an indication of where we are with the overall ambition with regard to climate change within the EU. So it's extremely important that we get at least the 90% that the Commission is currently putting on the table. The problem being that because of the international pressure, as I said, the EU is the only G7 country that doesn't have a 2035 pledge, because the UN is saying we need the EU to finalize its 2035 pledge by the end of September in order to be able to take this into the analysis that the UN will publish. Because of all this pressure, the European Commission member states are currently looking into a number of loopholes that will ensure that a relatively high target, the 90% that the Commission has originally proposed, can still be adopted, but with a number of exemptions and the use of international credits, which definitely would open a real basket of worms and problems that we have seen with the beginning period of the ETS. So that is something that needs to be critically looked at, and it will impact also the longer term objective of the EU to become net zero by 2050, which is a domestic net zero, so without international credit. So how will, in the period in between, international credits be accepted, and then in the long period no longer, is a whole question. And so the key message is that really this is something that is extremely critical for the future of the Green Deal, that we need to keep an eye on, and that we're actually expecting in the current geopolitical circumstances, where we have a US administration that is not supporting climate change, that we need the EU to stand up and really be very ambitious in the post-2030 period. Thanks you, and I give the floor back to Nora.
Yes, next slide, please. Great. So now to wrap up, we're going to look at what's next and what to look out for. We encourage everyone to continue monitoring the upcoming political developments, especially with all the knowledge we've now gained from the risk radar. In the last months, to recap, we've seen the competitive compass being revealed, the vision for agriculture and food, and the clean industrial deal. For 2025 and beyond, there are several files to look out for. As Wendell described just now, we are awaiting the 2040 climate targets. And then there's also COP30 coming up in November. Several reviews are coming up as well, such as the car CO2 standards and the electricity market reform. Some other key developments will be the evolution of the EU's climate and energy policy framework, especially looking at the emissions trading system with ETS2 and, as mentioned, possibly an ETS3 for the land use sector. The growing uncertainty over future national targets and whether member states are moving towards dismantling national responsibility on renewables and emission reduction. And then lastly, what is very important to look out for, with special focus on the post-2027 multi-annual financial framework, which will shape the EU's priorities and spending for the years to come, which makes this a real opportunity to align long-term funding with all our climate, biodiversity, and pollution goals. And with that, I'm giving back to Jörg.
Many thanks, Nora and Wendell, for this overview, although, of course, it sounded much darker compared to what I remember from our first risk radar in autumn last year. Nevertheless, maybe let's look for some hope, some more positive input. We have invited two practitioners from two very important sectors, agriculture and industry, to see what this means for them in practice and how to go on under this clean industrial deal. First, let's have a look to agriculture. We have invited Hans Thiessen. He's the head of climate at the Danish Agriculture and Food Council. Denmark is known as a forerunner in renewable energy. What is maybe a bit less known is that Denmark also is amongst the very few member states where the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture are declining now. And you even have just last year endorsed what you call a tripartite agreement, kind of societal consensus in Denmark, where the food and agriculture industry commits to reducing emissions and even to have an additional taxation on the emissions from livestock. So how did this come? I remember very harsh and quite heated farmers' protests in front of our door here in Brussels early last year. In Denmark, you have maybe a more consensual, interesting approach to solve the issues for farmers who are confronted with this huge existential challenge to deal with this climate transition.
Yes, I was just looking at Wendell's what he said, that the farmers' lobbies had too many results, and I'm part of the farmers' lobby, and I'm quite happy about our results, actually. But what we have done in Denmark is that, and it's quite important that the purpose about this agreement in Denmark was that the tax must not be designed in a way that supports the industry, and ensuring that the competitiveness of the industry is not diminished. And that's one of the things, you had a frame where the industry could see itself in the process. And our motivation, like a lobby organization, to go into these negotiations was that was the best option for us to become a part of the agreement. And the alternative had been that we had no influence and maybe a tougher regulation if we hadn't joined it. One of the things that's very important is that we have this carbon tax on livestock, but it comes, maybe I get too technical now, but it comes with a 60% base deduction. And that makes it possible for the most climate effective farmers to avoid the carbon tax by lowering the emission to the level of the base deduction. But it's quite important that when you make such an agreement, that the farmers can see themselves in the agreement and also see light in the end of the tunnel. So the way we did it, we had this three-party made, where we had the nature organization, we had the farmers organization, we had the industry, we had the municipalities, and we also had the unions as part of it. And then 8 ministers at the table at one time. And they made this agreement, and the farmers are quite happy about it in a way, because we had there came a lot of new money into the farmers, and they had a regulation that they could see themselves in. And yes, we have another culture in Denmark where we talk a lot together, and that made it possible. The culture, and Denmark is a rich country, though, so it could be supported with some money as well. I think that's quite important as well.
Hans, you said you were satisfied. Your members, the farmers, were happy even with this progress. What is needed on the EU level? Could we somehow replicate this exercise from Denmark? Do you think this could work? And if so, what should the Commission do? What do we need on EU level to get there?
I think it's to copy paste. No, I don't think so. but it's not either or, but it both, and you know, you can get have some inspiration from the process, from what we have done in Denmark, and maybe you could be inspired by the process, that it's very important to listen to the farmers and their anxieties about what's going to happen. The content, not totally, but some of the elements maybe. But what we need in Denmark now is that we have some that we have the same kind of legislation, so we have a level playing field to play on with the competition in Europe. So the Danish farmer is not in a poor situation than the rest of the European. And what we have been looking into is, for instance, suggestions about an agri-ETS. I guess you pronounce it, it's the third ETS. Here in Denmark, we call it agri-ETS, or another way of making a level playing field in Europe. And we just have to remember that if you as a farmer sit down and think you don't have to do anything and it goes away, you'll be surprised when your reaches become nearer the 2040 situation, where we maybe shall decrease with 90%, and that's not, you can't do that without you decreases in agriculture as well. Maybe I later can say what's important for the farmers to look into, but I think that's my major points now.
Good. Thanks a lot. I mean, that is quite some hope that there is a chance for societal consensus, and that also together with farmers we can go towards climate neutrality. This is maybe the point in time to bring in also Jutta Paulus to have the European Parliament's view. Jutta is a lawmaker since 2019 in the European Parliament, a member of the Environment Committee. She was also, amongst many other roles, shadow rapporteur of the famous nature restoration regulation, which was quite a cliffhanger. And maybe, Jutta, you can give a bit an overview. What is your impression when it comes to agriculture and biodiversity? Are the EU laws really effective in providing security, the stability, the trust that Hans was also alluding to, so that farmers can engage in this transition?
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for having me. Well, when it comes to the common agricultural policy favoring the transition, I think there is a clear no. And that's not just my opinion. We had several reports by the European Court of Auditors who have looked into the CAP, the legislation, but also the strategic plans and what the member states are doing. And the European Court of Auditors said, well, it is not appropriate to say 40% of the CAP is climate related and will help in the transition and help curb emissions from agriculture. They said this is not the case, definitely not. Also what we have seen, which you have also depicted in your risk radar, that many of the tools which were in the current CAP, I mean, we will be negotiating the next CAP already within this mandate, were taken back after the farmers' protests. So for example, the so-called GEAC, Good Ecological Agricultural, what's C for? I don't know. I only know the German Klötz, but never mind. There were several obligations which farmers had to adhere to in order to be eligible for EU funding, and those were all scrapped shortly before the European elections last year, and some were permanently scrapped. So, for example, the obligation to have 4% of your land being fallow in order to have spaces where biodiversity can go to, basically, to get at least some shielding from fertilizer and pesticides. So this is already gone. And what I have been hearing from our new commissioner, Christoph Hansen, is that he was very much in the line of, let's put not any obligations on farming, let's set incentives, but let's not force farmers to do anything that is related to biodiversity or climate. And I'm not sure whether this is the right way to go, because of course we have very different structures when it comes to agriculture in our 27 member states. We also have within the member states very different structures. In my own member state, Germany, we have huge agricultural industry, I might say, with stables with thousands and thousands of pigs or poultry or also cattle. And we have small farms, family farms, basically, which are really having a hard life and which are struggling. So I do understand the call by the farmers' lobby, and also by Mr. Hansen, that we have to support European agriculture, because we will not be able to produce for the same price as it has been being done in other regions in the world. But I firmly believe in public money only for public good, meaning that if you want EU money, you do have to do something that is serving society, and serving society more than just producing food. So I have the impression that the Danish model might work, but it has to be something predictive. The farmers I've been speaking to were always like, well, there are these programs, but those run only for 2 or 3 years, and this is nothing that we can really build our future on. And this is, of course, especially true when it comes to a total change of your business model. For example, when it comes to farming on degraded peatland, which has been drained. If you want to re-wet that peatland, which we urgently have to do in order to fulfill our climate targets, speaking namely of LULUCF, then farmers would need a perspective for 20 years at least, because that land will be re-wetted. You will need new machines, you will need new expertise to farm on that re-wetted land, doing polludiculture, and then even a CAP which runs for 7 years will not be enough. So the questions which come to me in that regard is, first of all, how do we get the farmers on board in all their diversity? Second question is, how do we secure the financial incentives that we would need for more than just 7 years when it comes to really transformative change? Because you won't be, for example, if you, let's say, build a new stable in order to increase animal welfare, you will not be able to pay back your debt within 7 years, obviously. So this is a challenge where I haven't found a solution yet, but certainly we will have to do something about the emissions coming from agriculture. I'm not sure whether there will be an emission trading system for agriculture at all, because we might come to that later. Right now, I have relevant doubts whether the ETS2 even will be implemented, because very many member states have already said that our citizens will not have this, and we will only serve the far right if we put more taxes basically on fossil fuels. We will not be able to afford it. So I do see a bit of, let's say, cracks in our whole climate architecture.
Okay, many thanks, Jutta. So I see, of course, you are asking for really a long-term strategy, long-term stability to allow farmers to engage, to go this way, this very long way. And for sure, we will need to keep an eye on that when it comes to the next multi-annual financial framework, when this will be for sure very topical and relevant again. We also need to reflect the diversity, the different sizes, characters, needs of agriculture, and the same applies obviously to industry. Our second panelist, Adeline Rocher from the Corporate Leaders Group Europe, she is dealing with the Europe program and organizing this platform of ambitious companies who have committed to emission reductions, to energy transition. Now, I would expect to see happy industry representatives because the Clean Industrial Deal obviously stresses massively the need to boost the competitiveness of EU industries. But of course, again, it's a question of diversity. There are many different industries with many different needs. So when you look at this Clean Industrial Deal, is it really the tailored support that your members are happy with?
Thanks a lot for inviting me, and very good to be here to discuss the Green Deal and Clean Industry Deal and the perspective for policy that have to do with sustainability and competitiveness, and ideally going hand in hand. Specifically on the Clean Industrial Deal, we were very happy to see that there was a set of propositions and that it was presented as a strategic effort to support the transition of EU industries towards more sustainable business models, maintaining their global competitiveness. But of course, it is a bit premature to have a very detailed assessment because a lot of policy files are still to be released. And the timeline seems a bit long for certain particular aspects. I'm especially thinking of circular economy, which will happen quite late in the process when there is a lot of development that would benefit from clarity earlier than the end of 2026. But clearly, there is a lot of worries in the industries that I work with on the back and forth around some key EU Green Deal files. And the Clean Industrial Deal is very interesting if it's designed also to complement and go further than the EU Green Deal. But if you unravel on the one hand and come up with new proposition on the other, it is very confusing. And the result is that that gives signals to investors that there is no clarity on the long-term plans, and we know that clarity on the plans and predictability are very important for a number of investors. I'm thinking particularly of the 2040 climate target or the NDC. I mean, there is a bit of a question on how the two are going to be sequenced, but generally speaking, having that long-term predictability over the next 15 years as to how the companies will need to invest, will need to renew their own sometimes machinery, or how they need to plan their own transition, it is very helpful for them to plan against specific milestones and long-term visibility. And the current stagnation or question marks around the climate targets as overarching direction of travel are a bit worrying. And I've heard some of my members saying that they were halting some investments, waiting for more clarity because they don't want to start engaging now, the same way it has happened on the number of reporting files, for instance, when I have some members who have started hiring staff and training staff for reporting obligations that now are being postponed, meaning that the fact that they were extremely compliant and even front runner in the implementation of those rules now represent an additional cost compared to competitors who have not made the same investments, but don't need to do the same investment this year. So there is this compliance risk that they see as quite concerning around all those uncertainties around the EU Green Deal, the effective implementation, the effective enforcement, and this is all giving them worries on the effectiveness of the Green Deal as it is to serve EU competitiveness, not of the spirit of the Green Deal, but the actual implementation or lack of implementation. And it is there are countless examples of bad policy making practices that have led to entire sectors being badly damaged and losing competitiveness ground globally. And we see the risk of that repeating again on other sectors where European industries are leading. And we are a bit worried about that trend.
Okay. I hear a bit between the lines, like in the case of agriculture, you are asking for long-term stability, investment security. The Commission came up with a lot of rather short-term simplification packages, these omnibus packages, where you can ask yourself, are they throwing something under the bus with this omnibus package? I mean, it's always good to remove bureaucracy and to simplify administrative procedures. Is this helping, or do you think I mean, there should be other priorities? We're expecting a lot of omnibus packages. Also, there's one this week coming again for agriculture.
I would say that there's a sense of we are throwing the baby with the bathwater. Yes, there is a need for certain simplification. There are some steps or some reporting points that may not be that useful, but that doesn't mean that the entire goal of the reporting and transparency and disclosure obligations should be entirely lost. And there's a question of how it is done. It is true that the European policymaking process can take time, but it's also it's the price of democracy, and it's the price to pay when you have 27 markets, which are, by the way, very fragmented, and it is something that could also be addressed a bit more strongly in the clean industrial deal. But that good policymaking takes time. Good policymaking also requires transparent processes. There is a lot of question marks, let's say, on who was consulted and how, especially on these omnibuses files. We had a very hard time sometimes to get the ear from the Commission services on certain aspects, and good policymaking requires time, but it also requires a transparent framework. And as it is done now, it's not transparent. It is all in a hurry, but that leads to bad decisions. And there is a sense that because the consultation are not comprehensive enough, we may focus specifically on certain segments of the economy or certain segments of the value chains without taking the big picture, meaning that there are other damage that could be done for the sake of simplifying some parts. And generally speaking, I don't think it's simpler to have changes in the policy framework 2 weeks before it's supposed to enter into force. So I think the term simplification has been misused a bit.
Okay, good point to mention that a good policy process, building a consensus, that needs time, that requires time for social acceptance, acceptability also. There is one file that took a lot of time that is more than due, namely the 2035 and 2040 climate target of the EU. And that is maybe one question I would also like to ask again to Jutta as a lawmaker. What do you think? I guess you are also waiting for quite some time for this target. We already had an event on this topic more than a year ago. What is the chance that the EU will go to the COP in Brazil, the annual climate summit, with a bold, clear, robust climate target for 2035 and 2040?
Let's put it that way. My hopes are rather low. We had a commitment by the Commission to the 90% in the last Monday, but this has sort of melted away like a snowball in the sun, which is, of course, also due to the changed majorities in Parliament and in Council. Let's not forget about Council, right? So when the first climate law was adopted, we had a structural majority of progressive governments plus a progressive majority in the Parliament, and both are gone. And as I said, even ETS2 is in danger, and there is a lot of appetite for going for Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, namely saying let's do some of our emission reduction in other countries, even though the experience which we made for that are, let's say, rather disappointing. And although in the new German coalition treaty, you know that we had both elections in Germany and that the new government was just sworn in last week. In the new coalition treaty, there is this cryptic thing of, well, we'll stick to the German target of being climate neutral in 2045. We had a Supreme Court ruling on that, right? So it's cannot just back away from that. But we will do this with the help of high quality emission savings abroad. And I am afraid that we might see something similar in the European target. No one has yet been able to declare, to really spell out what is a high quality emission reduction. and how do we make sure that it is high quality, and who's going to audit it, and how will we make sure that it stays that way? And more important even, what are we going to do when we will have climate neutrality globally? Because then there will be no other places where you can do emission reduction, obviously. So I think it is opening Pandora's box, relying on external emission reductions, but I would not do what some colleagues are advocating for, saying, well, then if we can't do the 90% without external emissions and we don't want to do external emissions, then let's go for 85 or 82 or how many percent, whichever we might just figure out in our heads. I would really love to see the 90% enshrined in legislation. Let's not forget that the advisory council said at least 90%, right? They didn't say 90, they said at least 90. But politically speaking, I have my doubts whether we will be able to secure a majority for that.
Okay, there's still some work to do, I see, with regards to the target. We have roughly 10 minutes left only. Maybe this is now a chance to connect you amongst each another so that you can react also to each another. But we also have quite a number of questions in the Q&A box. I would prefer first to go to those questions that are not written down by anonymous attendees. I see here a first question that relates to the emission trading system. Maybe this is a question that our two authors or that Jutta can answer. I will just read it out. You mentioned the risk that international carbon credits may be integrated into the EU ETS or counted towards national climate targets. Could you talk a bit more about this and how we could counter this development? Maybe it was mentioned earlier during the presentation of Wendel and Nora. Maybe you would like to come in, or Jutta, to comment on this from a policymaker's perspective.
I can say a few words. First of all, Jutta already referred to the advice of the European Scientific Advisory Board on climate change. It's very clear that they said that, look, if we want the EU to make a decent contribution to the Paris Agreement and the Paris Agreement objective of limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, the EU would need to reduce its emissions domestically by 90 to 95%. And on top of that, not within that 90-95, but on top of the 90 to 95, the EU would need to give substantial financial support to developing countries to make emission reductions in these countries. So the proposal to integrate international credits into the potential 90% target is actually a conflation of those two different objectives of the Scientific Advisory Board. There is at the moment no specific proposal that these credits would be part of the ETS or part of the non-ETS or whatever. I think that's all still a bit up in the air. But we've had in the first trading period of the emissions trading scheme back in the period between 2005 and 2012, we had these international credits. And one of the main reasons why at a certain moment the ETS didn't function anymore and had a extremely low price for carbon and an over allocation of emission allowances was because of these international credits. So it has already proven that it doesn't work within the ETS. I think that's one thing. So how can we stop that? I think there are quite a lot of reports, studies, scientific publications that clearly indicate all of the problems that are linked with using international credits, with conflation of baselines, with the question mark whether emission reductions really happened, whether these international credits are actually helping climate action and so on. So I think there's quite a lot already existing that we should bring into the debate, because let's be honest, the only reason why international credits are being proposed is to reduce the level of action that the EU would need to take, and that we cannot allow.
Okay. Jutta, do you want to come in on this topic also?
I think Wendell covered it very, very well. And yeah, I mean, right now I do have to admit that although my motto is never give up, I don't see how we could manage to limit global heating to 1.5. I mean, we are already, I think, the 14th month now above 1.5. And we're seeing devastating consequences. Also, those circles which are even fueling runaway climate change. Like the hotter it gets, the more permafrost is thawing, more methane is set free by those thawing soils and all that. So I'm not sure whether my fellow politicians have fully grasped which impact this will have on our societies and, of course, also on our industry. So, yeah, and unless we manage to make people listen more to science, I don't see how we can actually get a scientifically valid target, let alone the political actions which that would impose.
Good, that's a call for action. And I see still a few questions or rather remarks and some anonymous comments in the Q&A box. There's several that relate to agriculture, in particular in Denmark. There's a question also on financing. How do you deal with the fact that especially small farms would run out without the CAP support? I'm not sure I fully get the direction, but maybe this is something what we covered regarding the diversity of different sizes. Obviously, that goes without saying. I don't know if Hans wants to come in and comment also on this, or one of our two authors. Hans?
Well, what we're it's not for the time being the CAP financing that's the problem for the small farmers in Denmark. It's more that when you have a small farm, you have the same rule and regulation as larger farms, and then you have a lot of it costs a lot of money to have all these regulations, and that means when you have a smaller farm per unit that you produce, you have a larger costs. That's the problem right now, and the financing from what we're doing in Denmark now is partly coming from the government, and then I guess that the farmers are also going to pay some of the new measures and so on, and the other challenges for the smaller farmers is that the technical implementation of new measures can be harder for them than the larger farms.
Okay, good. Of course, there are many more topics. This is a very large scope for this webinar. We really try to cover a bit of whole European Green Deal and the new Clean Industrial Deal with different sectors being affected that have to act. We are coming to the end of this webinar. I would still like to give our two authors, Nora and Wendell, the opportunity just maybe to draw a conclusion and to compare a bit last year's first edition. This one, we already felt a bit, there's maybe a bit of a darker mood now half a year later. But maybe still you can give us a bit of more positive vibes in the end. What is your impression when you follow this debate on these crucial two sectors of industry and agriculture? Do we still have the right tools? What would be the main tools? Maybe you can summarize in a few sentences, Nora and Wendell.
Sure, I can start with just saying that, I would definitely underline what's been said on all the concerns of political short-term, also profit-driven interests currently rising or seem to be rising over long-term science-based policy making, and that we really need to focus our efforts on bringing that bring that to the forefront, the science-based policymaking. Even if it seems like other forces are taking over, we need to keep on working on that, specifically as civil society, and together with the policymakers such as Jutta in the parliament. And then also quickly from me as a response to Adeline, who mentioned, and also the others mentioned, the need for long-term stability and investment security. I think this is also something that that we need to underline, where we really need laws and milestones which are not being watered down somewhere in the middle of the process without any clear impact assessment and without following the democratic processes which are in place. So I'm hoping for the future that this is not taking place again, or that we can stir in the direction again for science-based policymaking.
And maybe just one last word from my side. I mean, both Adeline and Hans have brought the message that there are frontrunners. And I think it's very important that we recognize the important role of these frontrunners, but that they're currently not necessarily supported by the constant questioning of existing legislation. And I think that the more we can get the frontrunners to bring their voice in favor of stability, but also in favor of ratcheting it up rather than ratcheting down, I think that would be part of a better future. Thank you.
Okay, it's already 3. If we stick to the running idea, this might lead us to the idea that, yeah, it's a bit running a marathon. It takes a long time. You have to have a good exercising, good training, of course. This is what reaching our targets is about. Quick fixes and doping might not help, and let's try to stick to this path. We hope that we have given you a bit of an overview where we are in this debate. You can find this updated risk radar on our website. Also, the slides will be made available for downloading. I thank all those panelists who joined, who took the time to discuss. Sorry if we were not able to touch upon all the questions and all the other important elements that were posted in the Q&A box. Let's stay in touch and continue this debate. We will for sure keep an eye on agriculture, on industry, and how to deal with this clean industrial deal in the future. Thanks a lot for joining. See you soon. And if you still have 1 minute after this webinar, there is an evaluation survey where you can rate yourself how you like this webinar or mention which other topics we should cover. Please feel free to add this. It would help us a lot to evaluate ourselves. Thanks a lot again to all participants and the panelists, and looking forward to discuss with you in the future very soon. Have a nice day, and bye-bye from Brussels.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you to Heinrich-Böll Foundation.